So how successful were Cambridge Analytica themselves, coming into 2016, they were then part of two of the biggest upsets of modern political history. Now, you can debate as to their influence in said upsets, but I think we can at least say they were part of those successes.
Yeah.
So previously, and this is something I came across quite a lot in my research for my book, in the chapter where I write quite a lot about SCL, was that they seemed to be very good at marketing their skills at marketing. Or they were very good at creating the illusion that they were these propaganda messaging geniuses. And it's very unclear as to how good they actually were at it. What is your sense of that?
So, okay, I wasn't there on all their campaigns and things like this. Obviously, I'm just a researcher. So I'm going on, what I've managed to discern from my, interviews with the company, from evaluations of what they had done that were published by, that I've managed to obtain through freedom of information and things like that from governments, through having talked to governments who hired them, from, evaluations of the tools that academics have done, of course. So from all that, I would say, for me, some of the most damning evidence has been, from people within the company themselves, as well as, the military, the UK military, who evaluated the tools. And really, they found them, yes, useful, but not like overwhelmingly powerful in the way that the company claimed they were. SCL on its website, for instance, in the early days, claimed to be the most powerful weapon in the world. Well, anyone could tell that's a load of rubbish. But I do think that there is a lot to this argument that, academic, skills and research and behavioral science can enhance methods of persuasion, that focusing on behavioral change and what you want to achieve as an outcome may well be, a better approach for some military purposes, for instance. I think it raises a lot of issues in the, political, democratic elections, as I've explained a little. But, I don't think that this is bad science, okay? These are common principles that are deployed by a lot of different companies nowadays. And, the work that they did seems to have varied quite greatly. So there are campaigns that they worked on which actually look terribly badly researched, okay? The work that was behind it, appalling. However, other campaigns that I've looked at look very well done, quite honestly, in terms of like effectiveness of research. So I think it very much depended on who they had at the time working on the particular campaign. And there was an awful lot of variability in the work. Also, I'd make the distinction, of course, between what behavioral dynamics was doing and what Cambridge Analytica did, which was very different methodologies. And the Cambridge Analytica methodology, which was based on social media data, seems to have been comparable to other similar approaches in most senses. But research that I've been looking at, from within the company, that what they had been, evaluating seems to suggest that their targeting of neurotics, for instance, with fear-driven messaging, created a lot more engagement. And so it might be that some of these particular tools, or methods, had a greater efficacy and in quite concerning ways. So I would say that, it just depends on what you're talking about. Would this be something that sells a lot of, soda or, gym memberships? No. Would it help you sell, guns, for instance, or would it help you elect certain types of politicians? Probably. And so I think as with everything, the methodology that you choose may well, differ in its effectiveness depending on what you're applying it to. So I would say it varied across time. Don't forget, this was a company that was running for like 30 years, basically. A small to medium-sized company. I want to stress that because, they were not the only company in the world. But they also worked on a heck of a lot of different campaigns in very different media contexts. And they would have had more skill in some places than in others. They would have been working with very different media, very different data sets in different parts of the world. And you have to take that into account when you're saying, is this an effective company or not? Well, they're doing different things in different places. So how do you say, based on one example, everybody's looking at the United States, for instance, and what they did for Trump, and then generalizing across the company of, oh, well, they were not effective, or they were really effective. Well, I think you have to look across the different places that they worked and look at the different campaigns, look at their effectiveness and their, ethics as well, and how they were done, and try to understand those in a more nuanced way. And that's something I'm trying to do for my book.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said about why that fear-based messaging in particular was so successful in the Trump and Brexit campaigns and has not been seen to be as effective in other places or before or after. How much do you think...
cultural resonance that needs to be taken account of here. And every campaign that they worked on around the world, was in a different cultural context. And the messaging you develop and the data set on which you develop it will be different depending on where you work. Some places, for instance, a lot of parts of the world, they would not have had the data set that you had in the United States. If you're looking at the African campaigns, for instance, you would have very, very different data available to what you have in the United States. So I think generalizations that have been made, about effectiveness and data sets are really unhelpful. But they, I do think that we should be talking more about the ethics of what they were doing and how they were doing it, and things like voter suppression, and looking at like the extent to which this occurred, I think is really quite important.
So I want to get onto the ethics here in a minute, but I'm curious as to how much you think social media has changed their game from when they set up from when SCL was started in the sort of mid to late 80s and the 2015 world onwards, where we had micro-targeted ads and incredible data sets for people on social media. Like how much has social media both given them the data sets that they previously would have had to search very hard from, and has potentially actually also killed their business model in a way that they're not as unique anymore because so many people have access to such detailed data on populations because of things like Facebook?
Okay, so there's a lot to pick apart there. Okay, so first of all, when the company first set up, and actually the whole of like SCL's work before Cambridge Analytica was spun off, was all about behavioral change with fairly traditional, based on sort of fairly traditional data gathering methods, mostly. And that's involving these kinds of behavioral polling and things like that. So it's interviews, it's surveys and things, but using the kind of methods like I've talked about. So you're orienting it around how to change behavior. That doesn't necessarily mean they were using social media data, okay? And really, it wasn't until Cambridge Analytica happened that they started, developing this data set to set up in America because they knew that other companies in America were already using social media heavily. So it's not like they invented using social media, okay? I want to make that clear. So it wasn't something that has, resulted in their business model becoming less unique or, more readily available to others and so on. I would say that it's more that the social media was becoming available all throughout this whole time, from sort of like the 9/11 period onwards. And actually governments were using this, extensively throughout this period, where SCL were using fairly traditional surveying and interviewing techniques and things like that, because they believed in the richness of the data. Now, new data sets obviously expand on that greatly and enable a hell of a lot more behavioral information to be available. Like, what are we buying, for instance? How does this, open up a window into our culture and our behavior and our personality and so on? And Cambridge Analytica's role was really to try to exploit that to be as much as possible, but also to exploit people's belief that this was the thing that would be the key to persuasion and key to manipulation and behavioral change and so on, because it was a big seller at the time. Okay, and it's something that, yes, I think they developed quite unique and quite troubling methods with Cambridge Analytica, with the help of Steve Bannon and so on. But it also is something that didn't really detract from the sales of their original product in defense, I would say. That was still very much respected, particularly by governments, as something that, actually was seen as really key to understanding audiences in a more nuanced and more in a richer way, because qualitative data about small groups that you want to change is probably more helpful for psychological operations, because you're not trying to necessarily move a huge group, massive groups and, of electorate. You're actually trying to sometimes just create changes among small groups of insurgents. Now, it's better to understand those on small data. They don't necessarily need a massive polling of the whole country and modeling of them on social media and so on. And this would not necessarily be available for somewhere like Iraq, Afghanistan, or, many of the military contexts that, governments would be working in. So you may well be wanting these kinds of smaller data techniques of behavioral change, much more appropriate to those kind of places. And the types of media may be, populations might be more used to using the radio as a media form than social media. This is something that took off more, in the latter period of the company's kind of work.
So should we be allowing this kind of technology to be used in a political context or even in a military context, to be quite honest?
You mean what Cambridge Analytica did?
Yeah, I know that some of the tools that they were using were looked at by the UK government, as you mentioned, and some of them at least, I think, were export controlled because they were considered to be a weapon. And as you mentioned, we can sort of speculate to the efficacy of said weapon. But that
was BDI. So that would have been the behavioral dynamics methodology and the work that was done for the British government, the military side of their work. And yes, this does seem to have been methods that were then deployed in politics. And that concerns me. It wasn't that... I think this is the type of methodology which then Cambridge Analytica developed upon to create what they did with social media. So the basic method was that of the Behavioral Dynamics Institute, and that was used for their earlier campaigns, both political and defense. I think personally that companies shouldn't be working in both political campaigns in the kind of places that SCL and Cambridge Analytica used to work in, and working for our governments. I think there needs to be a lot more control over where defense contractors can also work. And I think that they should be required to declare where they are working. And that background checks should not just be applied to specific individuals that are working on military campaigns, but should apply across the whole company. And, you know, the hiring of SCL in other, you know, countries for its political work, to me, is something that is troubling. I don't think companies should be able to do that. And it's not just that company that is hired, you know, for two purposes. You know, this is something that is pretty ordinary in contracting. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those companies are all doing bad things, okay? There is supposed to be a firewall that exists between the political work that these companies do and the military work. Personally, though, I think this example shows that there is too high a risk by enabling companies to work across different domains. Yeah.
It's concerning. I mean, one of the things that makes it so difficult to even attempt to regulate that kind of thing with these companies is that. So we've already talked about SCL, the SCL Group, the Behavioral Dynamics Institute. We've talked about Cambridge Analytica. We haven't even mentioned Aggregate IQ, which are definitely 110% totally not the same company. They just got all their contracts funding and all their intellectual property is owned by Cambridge Analytica, but it's not the same company. No. And
it's certainly not SCL Canada.
Definitely not SCL Canada. I don't care what that phone listing was on their website for Zach Massingham, the head of Aggregate IQ. If anyone's interested in what we're talking about, I will link some of the stuff I've written about this in the description.
And if you don't mind, if you can link to some of what I've written, that would be great too.
Yeah.
To learn more.
Yeah, I definitely will. I'll put links to all your stuff that I can find as well, or anything you want to send me. Go ahead and do that. But thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, or sign up to our mailing list. Thanks a lot to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, the #1 most trusted VPN. Get lightning fast connectivity with servers in 160 locations across 94 countries. Keep your browsing privacy safe with ExpressVPN and get a 35% discount on 12 months of ExpressVPN when you follow the link in the description below. Don't forget my book is now out and available to order on Amazon and on bookshop.org. That's Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. And most importantly, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.